So I would like to warmly introduce my co-panelist here, Miodrag Mitik, who is the Principal Director of Strategy and Consulting for Sustainability Services at Accenture. He is based in the Brussels region, so we're on different time zones this morning. I am based in New York City. And to briefly reintroduce myself for folks who have joined in progress this morning, my name is Marissa Brock. I am the Senior Director of Policy and Government Affairs at Sourcemap. I manage our relationships in Brussels, so I am actually back and forth to the Brussels region as well. And our topic this morning is unpacking the proposed EUDR delay, what companies should do to ensure they don't get left behind. So this is a very hot topic in Brussels at the moment. I actually vividly remember waking up to the news of the EUDR delay announcement because obviously I'm on Eastern time, so this happened early in the morning, New York City time. It was afternoon European time, but I'll personally say that I had been slightly suspicious that a delay announcement was imminent because the EU Commission had been essentially radio silent for the entire summer, whereas in 2024, in the lead up to the announcement of that delay, there were leaks coming out, there was information coming out. So obviously this sort of feels like deja vu. We already went through this a year ago, but on the other foot, this is a very different, these feel like a very different set of circumstances this time around compared to 2024. And again, from my perspective, the complete radio silence was a bit concerning. I remember thinking they're either digging their heels in and saying, we're going to completely ignore the external pushback and just proceed forward, or we're fully intending to delay and are just, sort of locking down and, preventing any leaks. So let's dive into this panel today. Of course, we're still awaiting the next steps in the legislative process to officially move this delay forward after this announcement. But, so far, all signs indicate that the delay will happen. But of course, we're still awaiting the next steps. Miodrag, what are some of the next, or what are some of the things, I should say, that companies should be doing as they await the official announcement that the delay has officially gone into effect?
Well, Marissa, it depends where the company is at their level of compliance maturity. So it's a very varied situation in the marketplace. We have, what we observe is some clients are lock and loaded, ready to go. They have invested in all the processes, procedures, change management, supplier due diligence, and they were actually ready to get started. Actually, some of our clients already, I must admit, at a smaller volume, but they're already filing the due diligence statements with EU traces. So that also leads me to believe that when the European Commission cites as a reason for the delay the maturity of EU traces, that is sort of a partial answer to why do we have a delay. But so if you are mature in this, well, you're all set up. It doesn't really matter if this is delayed or not, because you're ready. Where this presents an opportunity is to those who are either half ready, and I like to use that term half ready, because typically what they have done, they have created some sort of a due diligence procedure. They have made the link between the approval of suppliers and the deforestation-free status of the supplies that they receive from them within their internal traceability systems with the products that they're placing on the market or trading. And of course, all this need to be put into action. And you don't know how well you have designed the system until you start using it. So they have an opportunity really to reinforce, I would say, the design and the robustness of the implementation, the rollout of the design, together with their vendors, with their different internal stakeholders. But most importantly, they have now extra time to work on perfecting that due diligence system, which is basically the supplier-facing part of the system, and to perfect how they have visibility over their supply base's ability to be compliant with the regulation. So that is, and of course, believe it or not, we have seen among our, Accenture has a very large client base, and we have been implementing EUDR since we started our EUDR practice in 2023. And we have now over 100 practitioners and clients from all the 7 commodity groups. Some of the clients that we have approached that are subject to this regulation, some of them are still sitting on the fence, and some of them have only done some preliminary work. And if there was no delay, I really don't know how they will be compliant in this short time that we have between now and December. So this is not to say that this is an excuse, but just to say it really depends on what is your maturity level. And I would say that for most of the actors, it is a rather half full than half empty glass. And this is basically a blessing to just give them extra time to be 100% compliant.
It's interesting, I know we'll talk about this a little bit more, as we progress this discussion, but we're seeing, to your point, of sort of companies feeling like it's sort of a glass half empty and half full. To some degree, frustration and relief, not just from companies, but from their suppliers. I will say that some of the companies that we work with have already shared with us that some of their suppliers immediately reached out to them and said, "Oh, we heard that the deforestation regulation is likely going to be delayed. This is great because now we have additional time. We weren't ready." So it's really interesting seeing, how many stakeholders in this space felt that they weren't prepared, even with the additional year. I mean, as we've said, there was already an additional year from the delay that went into effect in 2024. So, again, we'll continue to talk about this, but 12 months is not a lot of time. It goes by very fast, and obviously this regulation is quite complex. So, I think the companies are grateful for the additional time, but it's not time to just sort of sit back and say, okay, I'm grateful for this delay. They can't, be in the exact same place in October of 2026 as they are in October 2025. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the speculation around this delay. I know that, everyone who works in public affairs is always a little hesitant to wildly speculate, but we would be remiss to not address some of this because these are some of the questions that are floating around quite a bit here, and there's quite a bit of speculation around further simplification of the regulation and of the adopted text, specifically around the introduction of a no-risk country classification, and then also of removal of the trader responsibilities. I want to sort of first talk about the introduction of the no-risk country classification. So I'll first, for folks who maybe don't understand what that is, I'll explain that, and then we'll sort of talk about whether or not we think that's actually likely. The introduction of the no-risk country classification is actually, redundant of something that came up in 2024, but because the adopted text was not reopened in 2024 and the regulation was just delayed, this ended up being removed from the discussion. But essentially, currently with the country risk benchmark, there is just the low, standard, and high risk classification for countries. What stakeholders have been pushing for is the addition of a no risk country classification that would essentially remove due diligence responsibilities for operators that are sourcing from countries that are classified as zero risk or no risk. So that would include the responsibility to even submit a due diligence statement. So right now, if you're sourcing from a low risk country, if you're subject to simplified due diligence per Article 12, you're still submitting a due diligence statement for goods that are coming from that low risk country, but you have simplified due diligence for that good. But a no risk country, which is not currently in the adapted text and would require a reopening of the text to be included, would have no due diligence associated. So this is a whole new debate. And again, something that came up in 2024, but then ultimately didn't become part of the conversation. So that is something that has come up as part of the sort of potential for further simplification. And then the other topic that's come up has been the removal of trader responsibilities. So when we talk about that, we mean currently traders, I should say, are required to still submit a due diligence statement for a product that has obviously not been further transformed. A trader is just reselling a good on the EU market that has not been further transformed. They're not a downstream operator. They're not transforming the good in any way. They're just reselling a good. What stakeholders have been advocating for is remove the trader responsibility. One of the arguments that's come up around this has been this places not just an undue burden on the traders themselves, but also on the IT systems, on the EU Traces system, which is a curious argument to make because, as most folks are aware, the EU Commission blamed the delay on the lack of readiness of the IT systems. So, there's been some speculation on whether the removal of the trader responsibilities is actually a genuine possibility in terms of simplification. So this is a lot of context to include, but I'm including this for folks who maybe are not aware of what this sort of what the context around these simplification conversations. So for you, Miodrag, I'm curious, how likely do you think this time around, with sort of the different landscape we're looking at in 2025 versus 2024, how likely do you think it is that the text is reopened, that these simplification options are genuinely considered? And if these simplification options are considered, if the text is reopened, I mean, what might this mean for operators, and traders, and for the regulation in general, if they were to be included?
Yes, so it's always unthankful to speculate on what will happen in the future. But having seen what has happened so far in not just the EUDR saga, but in other regulations as well related to the EU Green Deal, we can expect, changes are part of, they're the only constant. So of course, things will change. But let's try to kind of unpack this from a different perspective without going into speculations. So what is the DDS submissions and EU traces? I mean, think of it, it's a repository. You have to register so that you can upload data on it. Once you have registered yourself, you're eligible to upload data. This data is structured, so it's not like that you can upload anything you want. You have to follow a certain structure. And you have an API which allows you to avoid manual data entry and actually export of that data, structured data, from your IT system to EU traces. Not exactly rocket science. So all the story about, I know it has to work at scale. I know it has to have a very quick response time, and it's not as simple as I make it out to be. But where is the real complication with this? If businesses incur quite significant efforts and costs to collect this data and then to upload it, I think it's fair to ask, what will we expect the European Commission to do with the data that we have uploaded there. I mean, what's the point of it all? So where the EU traces system may fall short is at least in this transparency and readiness for how the data will be used. So we have had the opportunity to speak to a couple of national competent authorities, and one of them actually told us, well, you know, we are going to use EU traces because we're going to take the due diligence statement, and in a automated and progressive way, we are going to actually examine if the geolocations that are part of that due diligence statement are indeed deforestation free or not. And we're going to go for an automated check. And if this automated check raises a flag, then it's going to go to a human operator who is to do a desktop audit, so basically saying, is this really, is there an issue here? And if there is an issue, he's going to escalate it. And basically this escalation means that you would have to now initiate some form of communication. I don't want to use the term investigation or audit, but at least there's going to be some communication to start figuring out, well, is there deforestation on one of these geolocations or not? So we have two things here. One is the ability of EU traces to export those geolocations into a software that's going to take, and again, the question is which Earth observation, satellite imagery to actually confront the one used by the submitter with the one used by the European Commission or the national competent authority. So it is going to be done at national level or at European community level. This is not very clear. But remember, if it's done at national level, how many of these detections can we expect? And of course, will there be a certain amount of false positives, or will there be really detections of deforestation? And what kind of volume of investigations or follow-ups will this generate? And then goes directly to the proportion of how the national competent authority or member states are prepared. Now, we spoke to one of the national competent authorities that is very prepared. They hired they hired 10 additional inspectors to simply focus on EUDR. They developed a program. They even conducted a program of mock, it was done on a voluntary basis. They got 20 companies to be inspected on a voluntary basis. And they go quite far in their level of preparedness. So one thing which is unclear is what happens with the data submitted in EU traces, and is this going to result in automated checks or not? And then, of course, what does this imply in terms of the burden on the member states, resource allocation to EUDR, compliance verification? And then there is a second issue, which is, of course, are all member states equally prepared to verify the implementation of regulation, to basically enforce it in a uniform way across the single European market? Because you expect it's a single European market, the rules are the same for everyone, you expect also the enforcement to be the same. Where we know that this is going to be enforced because it's not a federation, the EU is not a federation, it is actually composed of member states, and this is with the remit of the member states. To connect this to another topic, how easily it is to say we can free the traders from the obligation to submit the geolocations, and we can just introduce a no-risk category where this would imply that a certain amount of commodities and products derived from these commodities would not be subject to verification and checks as they cross the EU border. Now, there is a big problem here, because if you wanted to, what is the most common way to circumvent the regulation? I am a supplier, right? I'm a commodity supplier. I have client A, I show him my fields, my geolocations, and I say, don't worry, I have perfect traceability, I've mapped all my geolocations, you're gonna get EUDR compliant materials from me. client B comes in. I show him exactly the same fields, exactly the same geolocations. However, of course, my fields can perhaps produce 100 tons of a material or a commodity. And my two clients, they order 200 tons. What do? I simply send the same geolocations to both clients, but one of them is going to receive the commodities that I purchased from a neighbor that are not EUDR compliant, from geolocations that are not being mapped. There's no proof of that. So if the European Commission doesn't take in EU traces the disclosure of the geolocations and basically says, well, I have these geolocations, let's number them 1 through 10, that have been submitted by multiple submitters. Let me calculate the theoretical capacity, the yield of what is the production quantity from these geolocations, from these fields. And let me then see corresponding, how many of these geolocations were declared as the source. And if I have imported 200,000 tons, and these geolocations can theoretically only produce 100 tons, well, someone is cheating here. Something is not right. It doesn't balance out. And then brings us to another point, which is guilty by association. So what the national competent authority needs to do in this case, if they pursue this investigation, they're going to look at the chain of custody. And they're going to say, well, these geolocations, they originate from these suppliers. Who have these suppliers sold their products to, and where does it lead into the EU? And of course, if you tell the traders that they don't have to declare the products that they've received, of course, you cannot conduct this mass balance calculations. You cannot figure out who is cheating or not. But if you don't do that, and if you don't publicly say that you're going to do it, then of course, those who are in the know are basically going to say, well, we know how to cheat. Now, the regulation places the emphasis on due diligence, basically saying, we have outsourced this to the private sector, to the industry. The industry has to figure this one out. But this is not a topic that has been addressed so far. So this is why I'm saying this is basically a hornet's nest. The moment you start poking on one or the other, you're going to have issues popping out. But to conclude on this, I do expect changes to the regulation. But how the Commission and the member states will navigate those different viewpoints, different interests, remains to be seen.
I think you bring up so many great points. I mean, frankly, the issue of circumvention of the regulation comes up so frequently, and it causes a lot of anxiety from companies, not because they're attempting to circumvent the law, but because they're worried about the extreme lack of guidance regarding what specific evidence they should be retaining to prove that they're not attempting to circumvent the law. I think the understatement of all understatements is there's really a lot to be desired in terms of the existing guidance. And you brought up so many great points around, specific areas where if the competent authorities, if the Commission decided to audit in a really specific and robust way, they would need to first provide really in-depth guidance around, the evidence that companies need to retain. Otherwise, those audits are, not, I don't want to use the word fair, but, if they're not providing guidance in terms of the types of documents that companies need to be retaining, then, it's difficult to say that companies are going to be prepared without that guidance. So
to be fair to the European Commission. So
yeah,
they write the law. They propose the rules.
mm-hmm.
They're not the ones. They don't have the capacity of enforcement. So the enforcement is really not in the remit of the European Commission. However, it is the remit of member states, and it is this issue of uniform enforcement which raises a concern. if in some countries you're going to have this very automated way and the usage of the data from EU traces and the usage of the DBS submissions in a very robust way, where in some other countries there is going to be a very, I would say, easy type of enforcement where the enforcement doesn't go that deep into the subject matter. Now, I know that the European Commission has this as a concern. I know that they're doing a lot of things together with the member states to make sure that they have the right capacity building, they have coordination, and so on. But I must also put a little bit industry into this conversation in terms of the stakeholder. Their trade associations that sit in do not serve the purpose of just lobbying the Commission. Actually, their purpose is to give information to their national member associations. And these national member associations have a duty to then take this information and disseminate it to their members, and they provide training and capacity building. Because a lot of the companies that are concerned with this regulation really do not have the information, and others have the information, but they do not have the capacity. They don't have the structure, the staff. I mean, there's a lot of things that you need to do. And one of these national competent authorities, as I said, they conducted 20 voluntary mock inspections. I mean, those were inspections on EUDR, but they didn't have any consequence. I mean, they were voluntary, so it's not like that the companies were subject to penalties or anything. But the outcome of these inspections was not very good. Basically, one-fifth of those companies basically was deemed to be compliant. All the others were non-compliant. And the main weakness was the due diligence system that was designed and operated by the companies. So essentially, they didn't do a good job enough of conducting due diligence of their supply base. And that's really the elephant in the room.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're imposing due diligence by regulation, which then imposes traceability, there are a lot of things here that need to fall into place for the entire supply chains to be compliant. And let's not forget, it's not about only deliberate circumventions. There is also errors. I mean, as long as you have manual systems, or if you don't have things worked out as they should be, there will be a lot of errors. And of course, the regulator needs to be able to deal with those errors. And not everyone that has a due diligence statement that cannot be corroborated, it doesn't mean that they deliberately set out with a criminal intent. Maybe it was just, it was just an error, it was just a miscommunication, duplication of files. Anything can happen. So we're dealing with a very complex issue that needs to be thought through and really needs to be planned into detail, not just from an enforcement point of view, but also from a compliance point of view. And also the big thing is, how does this add value to my business? Let's not forget the core issue with this regulation is it just a cost and burden, or does it actually provide value, or can I reuse the systems that I'm forced to implement and invest in for business value generation, which is not related to compliance law? And that's also something that I think we should be spending much more time talking about than simply about the nitty-gritties of the Brussels legislative environment and process, and the lobbying and the arguments pro and con.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to focus a little bit on sort of the business side of things, obviously we mentioned 1 year, a 1 year delay is really not a lot of additional time. We've obviously already gone through this once in December of 2024. What are some of the learnings that you've seen from the companies that you work with that we can take from the first delay? What were some of the challenges that you saw that companies faced over the last year that can be taken as learnings this time around for the second delay?
So I will try to answer this through the perspective of companies that actually are organized and large enough,
Mm-hmm.
have have dealt with the issue of deforestation before, because deforestation as a concern and as an issue is not new. It's already here with us for a while. It was addressed through corporate social responsibility initiatives. And these are voluntary, purely voluntary commitments, voluntary initiatives. So you will have a number of multinationals who actually have made pledges, have made some investments in programs. And to be very honest and fair to some of these companies, have invested in traceability, supply chain mapping, and even geolocation or polygon mapping as well. Now, there is a big difference between the rigidity, the robustness of the systems that you put in place on something that you're doing voluntarily as a sort of kind of a nice to have, vis-a-vis the requirements for system robustness and performance of these systems when they are regulated and you face the potential of fine or supply chain disruption if you're found to be in non-compliance. So this transition but we already are doing something with deforestation versus, wait a minute, now I have to do all these things, and there is a gap between the two, quite a significant gap. I think the best illustration is the Forest Stewardship Council, where they have had to rethink their certification schemes in the way that they conduct their certification audits, the way that their standards are written, to actually move from this voluntary, kind of assurance, corporate social responsibility type of, we are making efforts and we are concerned with this topic, but the level of performance and robustness of that had to be drastically improved. And when you see the new standards and the new frameworks that have come out of the Forest Stewardship Council, and I'm using them as a positive example, not to be think that this is in any way critique. I just want to say that the bar has been raised, and the bar of businesses addressing the issue of deforestation has also been raised, because now it's not pretend. You cannot pretend that you're doing something. You're being actually, by EU regulation, forced to actually do something about it. And what does this mean? Is basically stop sourcing from suppliers that cannot corroborate the deforestation-free status of their commodities. And we have now a confrontation between this, but we were fine with what we were doing before. It made us look good. It made us address a concern at our own pace, and also at the pace of our suppliers, versus now it is black and white. You either have proof of deforestation free or you don't have proof. And of course, there is a cost associated with this. And we need to address this cost head on, because to justify the cost, we have also to go into the root cause of deforestation. And the root cause of deforestation is not always, lack of regulation in the commodity producing countries, lacks enforcement or implementation of these regulations, or corruption, or all this kind of stuff that we associate with sometimes the reasons for why we are getting deforestation commodities that contribute to deforestation into our supply chains. Let's not forget that the primary cause is supply and demand. Because there is increased demand for these commodities, to meet this demand, you have this illegal, if you want, deforestation of the land to produce those commodities which are in demand. And I think that there is a more, let's say, a more pertinent conversation to be had around, is this now for governments to resolve at intergovernmental level in terms of trade regulations, market access, by regulations such as EUDR, which essentially limits market access for non-deforestation free products. And if we don't want to address this through regulations, because we have a trend which is really aimed at simplifying these regulations, to some extent weakening them as well, then how will business now recover from this previous position of corporate social responsibility and, if you want, voluntary approaches to addressing deforestation versus this proof-based system that is based on the EUDR regulation? How can it address this imbalance between supply and demand, and the fact that the countries that produce these commodities, which are known for deforestation, how do we actually help them, and how does the industry help themselves by addressing the demand for these commodities? So we need to actually have these commodities be grown, but in a legal way. Do we go back again to private-public partnerships? What is this triangle between the producers, the governments, and the large corporations who purchase a lot of these commodities? How do we solve this? And I think this is now an opportunity to say for the industry to step on its leadership, not just lobbying against regulations, but actually say, we have a plan, we have a vision, and this is how we will ensure that we have a continuous supply of commodities that we need, but that this supply is not generated at the expense of the negative environmental impact or climate change through carbon emissions. And that's really something for the Brussels Club, the policymakers in Brussels, and the lobbyists in Brussels to address, rather than these nitty-gritty details of the regulation, which of course are important, but are not the issue at hand. The issue at hand is the balance between supply and demand.
Really helpful tips there. I want to, I know we're coming up on time, but I want to just really briefly talk about supplier readiness, since this is something that we've seen come up as a challenge from a lot of companies over the last year. Even with the previous delay, supplier readiness, as I said, has been a challenge. Suppliers have been unprepared to share polygons and geolocation data in the proper format, or just the correct geolocation data. This has been something that companies have been frustrated with over the last year, and they've had to kind of go back to suppliers over and over again. They've expressed concern about, will this become an issue when they're actually having to collect this information from suppliers in real time or near real time, excuse me, when due diligence statements actually are being submitted to EU traces. And so they're attempting to sort of collect this information as early as possible from their suppliers and sort of pressure testing essentially their suppliers' ability to collect this information in advance. But what are some things that companies can be doing in addition to sort of these pressure tests? But what are some things that companies can be doing to prepare their suppliers with this additional year, especially with suppliers that are perhaps facing some challenges sharing some of this critical information? As we've talked about, year is going to go by very quickly. But any tips that you can share, anything that you're seeing with some of your clients?
Well, the supplier will be as responsive as the contractual framework and the relationship with the buyer is. Our first advice is always to revisit the contractual frameworks. So if you are sourcing directly from producers, there is more leverage and less excuses. When you're sourcing indirectly from traders, you need to have this assurance that, and of course, this also generates efforts and resources required for this effort, but to actually assess the due diligence that the trader has constructed into his own business so that you have access to the way that the trader is conducting due diligence and collecting, corroborating data that supports the deforestation-free status of the products that he's supplying. So essentially, we need to have, it's usually done through a sustainable sourcing policy or some type of, sourcing document. It doesn't have to be actually the contract itself, but you need to have a documented access to your supplier's due diligence system, where maybe your supplier doesn't want to share the exact geolocations and the exact identity of the farmers with you because they don't want you to go and buy, behind their backs directly. But what they have to share is the methodology and the level of performance of their due diligence and what corroborating data they have. And they need to show you not just the process, but also the data, and agree which extraordinary circumstances would warrant having access to this data and to that level of traceability which is required by EUDR. Because, as I said, EUDR is pretty much black and white. You either have proof of non-deforestation free status, or you don't. So it's either deforestation free or it's not. And if your supplier has not shown you the system that they have set up, have not shown you the records that are being produced by the system and the availability of the proof that they have, you don't have to consistently receive these records, but you have at least to go and see once a year that the system is put in place, that the system is functioning, and the data is available on request. And which circumstances trigger that request, this is up to be determined between the trade partners. So this is what I would like to say. The simplest thing is start really with this framework in which you have a sourcing agreement with your supplier and introduce the EUDR requirements into it. We have seen clients who have very large suppliers, very important critical suppliers, and they have actually taken a financial stake in those suppliers in order to have better control, better visibility, better assurance of the, well, not only deforestation-free status, but security of supply and security of the legal supply as well with regards to EUDR. So this can go very far if you go down this logic, and we go down the logic of, the resilience of my supply chain. How do I have the continuous supply of the commodities in the quantity, the quality that I need? This all point down to this procurement arrangements that have to have the sustainability component attached to them in addition to the other traditional elements that they have.
That's some really great points. I want to conclude here to just circle back to something that you mentioned earlier around speaking to some of the competent authorities from some of the member states. I had seen some of the reports from, I believe it was Germany and the Netherlands around some of the testing that they had done this summer around how they intend to carry out some of their, audits aren't really the the term that companies want to see, but as a reminder, in the current adopted text, there's a requirement for competent authorities to audit a percentage of operators that are sourcing from standard and high-risk countries. But you mentioned speaking to some of these competent authorities. Obviously, we've seen some of these reports from a number of competent authorities that have, tested over the summer. From my perspective, I'm curious whether you agree. Looks like there's a disparity in terms of the level of preparedness across the member states. And, this is more of a statement than a question, but, I'm curious how this will, I guess, play out once the regulation goes into effect, how that preparedness will actually impact the ability of the respective competent authorities to carry out their auditing and investigating responsibilities, because some of them really do seem like they're prepared. They're putting their processes in place. They're making sure that they have individuals prepared to audit, prepared to carry out these investigations. But that's certainly not the case for all of the member states. So I think that is a little bit of a gray area in terms of what that will look like across all of the member states. So I'm just curious whether you have some thoughts about that around that potential disparity across the member states.
Well, to be fair, the European Commission does, this is not the only regulation that they are implementing together with the member states. So they have ways of working with the member states. They already have established capacity building mechanisms and certain, financial budgets devoted to that. Ultimately, each member state has no choice but to either comply themselves as a member state with the EUDR regulation, or to be found to be non-compliant as a member state and then named and shamed and dragged toward the European Court of Justice and so on and so on, and maybe even be fined if they're not implementing the regulation. So this disparity is I would say, quite normal at the beginning. In my career, I accompanied the food industry with their, the food safety regulations and the enforcement of those, the healthcare industry with the patient safety through counterfeiting and all these other issues that we have, and also the enforcement of those regulations. So we are at the beginning. What is going to happen is that very soon some member states will be the best in class, and a standard will emerge on how do you conduct a EUDR audit. And you already have pointers, I'm sure, that they've received from the European Commission. They have the legal text in front of them. So they're all going to address the same issues, I think, in a coherent way. The only question is, in the first couple of years, is what is the priority and what is the staffing level, the capacity level, and the automation level, the use of ICT tools to support those audits. So there shouldn't be any doubt enforcement will happen. And there should not be also any doubt that in the beginning, this enforcement is not going to be uniform. There will be some discrepancies. But over time, those will disappear. And over time, you will see a pretty much standard way of auditing companies, and you will see these tools emerge and being shared between the national competent authorities. What, as I said, is more interesting also to note is that the objective of the national competent authority is not to punish companies that are found to be in non-compliance, because there are many different reasons for non-compliance. They will always give, as a matter of principle, the opportunity to the company that has been audited and where non-compliances have been found to rectify the situation in a given amount of time. And of course, if non-compliances persist, then of course the company opens itself to possible sanctions. Where the national competent authorities are going to be very strict is when they find criminal intent, because they have the duty, it's not just the possibility, is their duty to actually refer to criminal prosecution when they have found a deliberate attempt to circumvent the regulation. And when this happens, and we see this in the headlines, that will probably be a wake-up call to even those who who don't have a criminal intent, but who actually have to comply with the regulation. They have not been audited, but they will probably ask themselves, okay, but what if we were audited? What would have happened? So it's a process that will take a couple of years, and it's also a process that will perfect not only the companies' response to the regulation, but also the solution providers and the platform vendors, where they perfect also the tools that they put at the disposal to the business community on how to respond to this regulation and how to more closely, I would say, bring the platforms with the due diligence procedures and the due diligence methodology and the due diligence systems of companies, so that we can automate to a greatest extent this process and cut costs.
Thank you so much, Miodrag. This was a really lively discussion. I want to really thank you for your insights. I'm sure our audience really got a lot out of this conversation. Just to sum things up for everyone, EUDR really is not going anywhere. Companies should absolutely not just sit back and wait to see what happens with the regulation. They should make sure that they are continuing to prepare themselves. This additional 12 months is not a lot of time, especially if there are changes to the adopted text that need to be accounted for. So, really, companies should continue to prepare themselves and make sure that they're ready for December 2026, or if there is a curveball here, December 2025. So thank you again, Miodrag. Really appreciate your time today. We're going to start the next session. I know we're a little bit over time here. We're going to start the next session in just a couple of minutes here.